The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
The introduction of the Road Transport Act 2001 in the Isle of Man made provisions for the regulation of the transport of passengers and goods by road. The legislation covers public passenger vehicles, or PPVs, which includes taxis, minibuses, buses and other vehicles. The current transitional provisions for apply-for-hire taxis mean that they're licensed to operate in one of 4 districts in the island, and the number of licences issued is restricted. Private hire cars are not subject to the same restrictions. The Act also makes provisions for the regulation of heavy goods vehicles. Those regulations are set to be phased in from next January. So, how are taxi licences issued? What would lead to a licence being revoked? How much emphasis is there on safeguarding when it comes to public passenger vehicle drivers? And how onerous will the new regulatory system for heavy goods vehicles be? Those are just some of the issues we'll be discussing on the programme today with Chair of the Road Transport Licensing Committee, Brendan O'Friel. But first, a bit about the RTLC itself.
It was set up in 2002 by following the passing of the Road Transport Act of that year, and it was a body, an independent body, not including any Tynwald members, for the purpose of regulating the heavy goods vehicle and the taxi and PPV generally industry.
When you talk about regulation, what sort of powers do you actually have? What do you regulate?
We have the power to allow people to enter the trade. We have the power to make sure that people are conforming with the rules. And we've obviously got, in addition to powers, we have the influence to try and influence people to behave in the best possible way for the benefit of the island and for the safety of the public.
So at the heart of this, it is public safety. It's about making sure that any vehicles that carry passengers are safe to do so and their drivers are fit to do so.
Yes, it's a classic regulatory role that public safety comes above everything else, and therefore making sure that people who drive are suitable for the task and that the vehicles that are used are again suitable for the task and are maintained to a decent standard. Those are the standards that we're setting. Those are the standards that we're attempting to enforce.
Now, when it comes to taxis, you've got 2 types. Now, that can be a little bit confusing for people. I mean, you issue licences for both of them.
There are 2 sorts. Taxis is the generic term that most people use, but taxi technically is really the apply for hire trade, which consists on the island of some 200 plus vehicles that are allowed to stand on ranks, are allowed to pick people up anywhere at all without notice, so they can be hailed in the street. The private hire cars, on the other hand, of which there are probably another 100 or so, these are vehicles that you have to pre-book. And when you pre-book them, the sensible thing to do is to agree a fare for the journey that you want to make.
And those fares, you have a hand in setting those as well. What criteria do you take into consideration when you're deciding whether or not they're going to be increased?
We only have a hand in the apply for hire fares, and we set the maximum that can be charged. Now, when we do that, we talk very carefully to the trade. We take account of such things as the rise of inflation, and particularly those elements of inflation which affect the taxi trade, for example, fuel. But it's then down to the operators what they actually charge. And of course, a lot of vehicles have got meters, so once we've raised fares, the meters have to be changed so that they reflect the new fares.
And how would you find out if somebody wasn't sticking to the fares that were set, was going above the maximum? Would you rely on somebody actually reporting that to you?
Yes, indeed. We're very keen to encourage the general public to respond to the RTLC And please, not just with complaints. We'd also like to hear about the good work, which very many of the trade do, because it's important, I think, that not only are we seen as people who will chase those who break the rules, but people who praise those who are doing a really good job.
There have been concerns, the RTLC has raised concerns in the past over taxi drivers bad-mouthing the Isle of Man. I mean, that's going back a couple of years now. Has that changed? Are you still getting reports of that?
Inevitably, reports of this sort are anecdotal, and they tend to be rather historic. What we do know for certain is that there have been examples of taxi drivers, particularly at the airport, talking in a very inappropriate way to passengers, bad-mouthing the island, basically, whereas the task of anybody who's involved in the PPV trade should be to present as positive a picture as possible of the island, to encourage repeat business, and of course to provide a good service to the passenger.
And one thing you have advocated in the past is customer service training for those who deal with passengers. I mean, have you got any further with that, or are you pushing a case for that still?
Yes, we're making steady progress with that. We've two elements to the training that we wanted to bring in. The first was safeguarding in the light of what had happened across, and also because we've had a few incidents on Ireland that have been disturbing. So we're planning on introducing training, compulsory training for all PPV drivers in both safeguarding and customer service. There is a pilot course scheduled before the end of this year, and hopefully a second pilot course at the beginning of 2019. And then we're planning on rolling out a general programme of training after April 2018. The idea is to try and get everybody through the training over a 3-year period. And it will very much focus on making sure people understand their responsibilities under safeguarding, encouraging the reporting of incidents to the authorities that might prevent something like trafficking or the exploitation of children. And we believe that training will be really helpful. And then the second half of the training is going to be about customer service, where we hope to encourage those with good practices to share them with their colleagues, and to bring up the standards to really an acceptable level right across the whole of the trade in the way that passengers and drivers interact.
And interestingly, when you touch on safeguarding, there's a report published in the UK this week which recommends the same thing in the UK, that the taxi trade itself, there needs to be something more robust in place.
Across in the UK, we've got something like 300 local authority areas that license taxis, and they've all got different, slightly different practices. The ones, as you would expect, like Rotherham and Oldham, places like that where they've had enormous problems over safeguarding, they've been busy introducing compulsory safeguarding, but that isn't common yet across the whole piece. So it's interesting to see that this new report that literally only came out a week ago is strongly recommending that all PPV drivers go through safeguarding training.
Administering that will give you a bit of a headache. You're a very small team, you've got a few people dealing with things. When you're adding more things on top, I mean, is it going to become too burdensome for you to actually roll that out?
Well, that's one of the reasons why it's taken us a while to get to the position we're at present, which is, I think, on the verge of being able to at least launch pilot courses. The way we're doing it is we're involving expertise at the college, who, of course, the college does customer service training in lots of areas, and they have a programme that was used, in fact, over 10 years ago, which we've updated, and they're planning on using again. In terms of safeguarding, the Island Safeguarding Board has got a number of trainers, and it will be one or more of those trainers who deliver the safeguarding training. RTLC committee members and staff will be supporting the work that goes on, and we'll be keeping a careful eye, because we want to make sure that it's effective, that it meets the needs of the drivers, of the public and of the island. So this is one of the reasons why we're having a pilot course, so we can test out that what we think will work does actually work. And I'm sure over a 3-year period we'll develop the course so that it becomes more effective.
And what kind of feedback have you had from the taxi trade about introducing introducing these sort of courses? I mean, have they been welcomed?
The people, we've talked to quite a lot of people over the last 2 or 3 years about this. There's been a general welcome for it. I suspect that some of the people who we are very anxious to take the course may not yet have fully heard about it, because we deal with quite a large number of drivers, probably over 500 or so. A lot of them, of course, part-time drivers. So while the response has been positive, I expect it to, when we reach those who it may affect most, because their performance is the sort of performance that we want to raise, I suspect that may be a little more challenging.
And another thing that has come up is a language barrier. You have not in the latest annual report, but certainly the annual report beforehand, there were concerns over possibly some drivers not being particularly fluent in English. Is that something you talked about, possibly working on that as well? Is that something you're still dealing with?
We are indeed, and we would hope that our new driver training courses will be one of the ways we may pick up anybody who has still got problems in that area that we haven't previously identified. What we've been doing with new applicants for driving, where we are concerned about their communication skills, we're now sending them up to the college, or we're certainly advising them that if they want to get themselves on with a driver's license, they will need to go to the college, take a course in English that will improve their skills, and then we'll reconsider their application. So we are building that up. Interestingly, that's another issue that's mentioned in the UK report that came out this week, and they again are stressing the need to have at least minimum standards in this area.
And when it comes to the issuing of licences, what criteria do you take into consideration? How does that process work?
Well, it depends what sort of a licence we're talking about. If we're talking about a driving licence, what we've got to do is to look at the legal definition that we have, and that really comes out of a judgment from the UK. The key word is that a driver is a fit person, and that means in practice you've got to look at any criminal convictions they've got, hopefully none, but those that have, we've got to look at them and see whether that is a debar to them having a licence. We've got to look at the way they interact with passengers. So, for example, if we got complaints about the way they approach passengers, that could lead to us conducting an inquiry, because that person might not be suitable to be a driver. To be fair to the drivers, they have to put up sometimes with some bad behaviour by passengers, so this is not a one-way street. There are occasions, particularly when people have been out celebrating late into the night, when the taxi drivers taking them home have to put up with a great deal, delivering people who are inebriated back to where they live.
That's an interesting point. I mean, you talk about safeguarding and recognising the signs of trouble and also best practice. But what protection is there for drivers in those sorts of situations? It's just themselves, presumably.
Well, one of the things that's happening in the UK, and there's actually a great debate going on about it in the UK, is the increasing use of CCTV in taxis, because that gives the driver and the passenger some confidence that if an incident occurs, there is a record of it, so action can be taken, whichever party, if you like, is at fault. Now, unfortunately, introducing CCTV brings with it inevitably issues about data protection and so forth. It also, there's a cost concern here. So what we're doing at the moment really is encouraging people to look at it, to think about it, and we do know of some people who are considering installing CCTV in their taxis or private hire vehicles. The other side of regulation for the PPVs is, of course, the operators themselves. What I've talked about is the drivers, but for an operator to be licensed, they have to have good repute. They also have to have professional competence and appropriate financial standing. So those people who are organising and owning, if you like, the trade, they also are regulated through being licensed as operators. And exactly the same approach is taken by the RTLC, that if people are doing well, that's absolutely fine. if there are issues, we're liable to call them in and see them, try to get to the bottom of the issues, and of course if it was really serious, their operator licence would be at risk.
And that would have a knock-on effect for any drivers who were dealing with that operator.
Oh, indeed. But of course, one of the things that we're constantly working on is where an operator does employ drivers, and there are quite a lot of operators in the island who just drive for themselves, are very small operations, and some of them are extremely good. But those operators who employ drivers, we've been stressing the importance of them getting a written agreement with their drivers, so that the drivers will tell them if they get into any difficulties with the police, so that can be reported to us, and also if there are any changes in their medical condition that would affect their driving, because we're all, I think, very shocked about what happened some years ago now when the bin lorry in Glasgow crashed, and it turned out that the person who was driving the lorry was really medically unfit to be driving. So we're trying to put in place safeguards for the general public about the way the operators and the drivers interact for public safety purposes.
Disclosure is an interesting point, because how do you know if there is something, if somebody has become medically unfit or has a conviction of some sort along the way in between the renewal of a licence?
Well, we don't. But one of the advantages of a small island community is that we do get quite a lot of information about those people who have offended. I don't for a moment think we get information on all of them, but we've certainly acquired a great deal of information from all sorts of sources, including the media. And we've found a number of drivers who failed to report having been convicted of some offence to the RTLC. So we've called them in, and frankly we've been very sharp with them about the fact that failing to report an offence is a very serious matter. The whole thing was compounded by the fact that the law was not as clear as we would have liked it to be, but that has now been amended, and from a future date, drivers will be under a legal obligation to report any offence that they commit to the RTLC. And frankly, that's something that should have been in the original legislation.
How often do you revoke a licence?
We revoke a number of licences. I mean, if I can give you an example, if somebody, for example, gets a significant prison sentence and is residing at Derby, we hold pretty well automatically an inquiry and remove the licence. Similarly, if an offence is committed of a serious nature involving public safety, for example, an offence against children, we would automatically hold an inquiry. We give the individual the chance to make their case, but there are a number of occasions now in the time I've been on the committee where we've revoked a driving licence because of that.
And when it comes to the issuing of licences, there has been a debate over all-island taxi licences for quite a while now. Is that something that's still on your radar?
Well, yes. By and large, the committee's taken the view right from the beginning that all-island licensing would be much more sensible. We are not in favour of a restriction on the number of apply-for-hire licences that are granted, because we think that fuels the market for illegal trading in plates. So there are many reasons why a pretty open market is probably in the best interests of the trade. Many of the trade will not see it that way because of their previous history. And like all things, many of these changes take time. But of course, we are in a completely different era now. The days when if you wanted a taxi, you went and looked for a taxi rank, are long gone. People pick up their mobile phone and book a taxi, and we understand about 90% of the trade on the island is in fact pre-booked by mobile phone.
When you talk about trading of plates, explain what that means.
Well, there has been for, by my calculation, 40, 50 years, perhaps longer than that. The people who've had apply-for-hire plates have traded them. They've sold them on to other people. Now, they've got absolutely no right to do that, because the apply-for-hire plate is the property of the government, and the RTLC, in fact, decide and administer that. There's a curious device built into the 2002 Act which allows the transfer of business, and people come in and see us and claim to be transferring businesses, and we know perfectly well that what's going on is there's plate trading really going on behind this. And we know that in the past, the cost of plates has been as high as £45,000. And there was a time, certainly, when people were collecting plates and keeping them in their drawers, in their homes or whatever, as a sort of hedge against their pension funds. It's all been, I think, quite damaging for the industry. It's quite sad, really. Nobody's been really prepared to deal with this because there was so much money involved in it. And we are gradually, I think, easing the trade out of that, but it will take some time.
And one thing there has been a few questions about in the House of Keys in recent times, in recent months, is the time it takes to get a vehicle through the vehicle test centre. Have you noticed a problem? Have you heard any in terms of the vehicles that you're regulating going through?
There have been some difficulties. We're aware of that because people who come in to talk to us about other matters will tell us that there's been difficulties in getting a slot at the test centre, and we tend to remind them that the test centre has got some flexibility, and our understanding is that at present it's improved the throughput of vehicles quite considerably. But our main link really with the test centre is that if a PPV fails a test, we are notified of the fact. We look at why it's failed a test, and if the issues that have caused that vehicle to fail a test are blatantly breaches of safety, for example, brakes or tyres or something of that sort, we call the operator in and we ask for an explanation of why that vehicle went up to be tested in the state that it was. Because our concern is that if it goes up to the test centre with those sort of deficiencies, what's it like the rest of the year? So we look at people's maintenance records and how they're running their business. And on occasions we've warned operators that if they go on having that number of test failures, we'll reduce the size of the fleet they're allowed to run. And on occasions we have done just that. So that's our link really with the test centre. We're trying to enforce the lessons that come out of the test centre finding faults in vehicles.
And one thing that has been mentioned in the past, and this relates to taxis, PPV vehicles, is the age of the vehicles. Is that still a problem? I mean, the Isle of Man is known for having a lot of vehicles that are possibly older than you would see driving around in other places.
We've noticed with the PPVs, the public passenger vehicles, we've noticed that across there has been quite a marked change in a number of licensing authorities to putting age limits on the vehicles that could be introduced into the fleet. And in some cases it's been as low as 5 years, which I think is really quite strict. But there's a lot now who are saying no car over 10 years old can be introduced into the fleet, no vehicle under 10 years old. We're nudging the trade in that direction. So, for example, if somebody comes up before us for renewal of a licence and they're running a couple of cars that are either coming up for 10 years old or over 10 years old, we ask them what their plans are for replacing those vehicles. Now, occasionally we come across somebody who's got an excellent car that has not had any test failures, though it's 11 years old, and we are pleased to see that it's doing so well. But we nearly always find with good operators, they will actually say to us, well, actually, we are planning over the next year or two in replacing the car, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So we are trying to nudge the trade towards getting rid of the older vehicles, because I'm sure that sooner or later Tynwald is going to turn around and say, really, we can't be having cars over a certain age, certainly not with huge mileage on the clock, running around as public passenger vehicles.
Now, does the RTLC regulate other passenger carrying vehicles like buses and minibuses operated by the DOI?
We do indeed. All the PPVs on the island, tours and bus vanning, all their vehicles carrying passengers are under our regulation.
And what sort of checks are they there? I mean, what are you looking for same basis? Is it
Indeed.
roadworthiness
It's the same basis, and it's well known that we've had difficulties from time to time with bus operators where there've been, for example, a number of failures at the test centre, and we've had to talk to the operators about their practice to make sure that they were following good practice. But I have to say that the bulk of the issues about vehicles that we had real doubts whether they should have been on the road have been with a small minority of the taxi and private hire trade.
And we see the DOI now moving towards a minibus service, which is essentially in the north of the island being piloted from Monday, which will be operating essentially on the same basis as some taxis would. Are there any issues there? I mean, you must be keeping a close eye on that.
We're certainly keeping a close eye on it, and at the moment they've got a 1-year period to experiment with this. I think that's in the interests of bus van. It's certainly in the interest of the travelling public, and it's probably in the interests of the rest of the trade. It means that the 1-year licence at some point will either be not continued, or if it needs to be renewed, there'll be a further opportunity for people to make comments about it. The advantage will be if we've got a year's experience of how the dial-a-ride system works, we'll know whether it's viable as a commercial operation, and we'll have some idea what impact it's had.
I imagine some taxi drivers won't be too happy about the project, though.
Oh, indeed. There were considerable objections made by the trade, interestingly mainly from Douglas rather than from the northern operators, and those objections obviously had to be taken account of before we came to a decision.
We'll have more from the chairman of the Road Transport Licensing Committee, Brendan O'Friel, after the break, when we'll be turning our attention to the forthcoming introduction of new regulations for heavy goods vehicles in the island.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
On this week's programme, we're discussing the work of the Road Transport Licensing Committee with its chair, Brendan O'Friel. In the annual report for the year ending the 31st of March 2016, which was laid before Tynwald in April last year, the then outgoing chairman of the RTLC, Keith Watterson, said he believed up to 50% of heavy goods vehicles were not roadworthy at any one time, despite having an annual MOT-style test. The regulation of HGVs is something covered by the Road Transport Act 2001, but it wasn't until this year that the regulations themselves were approved by Tynwald. This is some of what Infrastructure Minister Ray Harmer said when the motion was debated by Tynwald members in July.
Road Transport Regulations 2018 introduced for the first time regulations of heavy good vehicles that are used on a commercial basis, and secondly consolidate with amendments of 7 existing regulations. At present there are no regulations in place to ensure that heavy goods vehicles are properly maintained. As such, the safety of the island's pedestrians, cyclists, drivers, passengers is reliant on the working practices of the operators undertaking regular maintenance checks and keeping a voluntary record of those checks. The introduction of these regulations follows a tragic accident involving the death of a young cyclist in 2005 when a wheel came off a heavy goods vehicle. As there were no regulations in place at the time, there was little that can be done to prosecute anybody in relation to the vehicle's condition. The intention of these regulations is to ensure that operators are undertaking regular and appropriate maintenance so their vehicles are kept in a roadworthy condition. The Road Transport Act 2001 provides for the regulations of heavy good vehicles and public passenger vehicles, taxis and buses. Public passenger vehicles have been regulated for many years and are the subject of consolidated regulations mentioned above. The Road Transport Regulation 2018, if approved today, will introduce regulations of heavy goods vehicles. The regulations introduce a 2-tier system for goods vehicles. The first applies to all vehicles that work off island and replicates the more comprehensive system that operates in the United Kingdom and in Europe. This was agreed with authorities that enforce goods vehicle legislation where Manx vehicles enter the United Kingdom. The second tier applies to those that are only working in the Isle of Man, and it basically amounts to a basic registration system where the operator will need to register their business and vehicles. The difference between the 2 tiers is for the need for off-island operators to comply with items such as financial standing and professional competence. Both tiers will ensure operators complete daily walk-around checks, regular preventative maintenance inspections and servicing in accordance with the vehicle manufacturer's requirements, which all competent operators will already be doing. When an operator takes its vehicle for an annual test at the Vehicle Test Centre, records should be produced that confirm maintenance and any noted abnormalities and the remedial action that needs to be taken. Assuming the vehicle passes its inspection, operators will be issued a certificate to enable them to obtain an annual disc from the Road Transport Licensing Committee, which will cost £40 for each vehicle. The purpose of the regulations is to promote a high standard of maintenance of goods vehicles and to move the emphasis from government checks and enforcement to operators taking more proactive measures and responsibility for their vehicles. The regulations will also remove the situation where an operator takes the vehicle for annual tests in order to identify any problems and then repair them. The regulations provide the vehicle should be maintained in a roadworthy condition at all times. Through the regulations, provisions contained in the Road Transport Act 2001 provide an appeals process against a decision made by the Road Transport Licensing Committee, which is taken to the High Bailiff. For any concerns regarding the Vehicle Test Centre, the Department's internal review process allows for a thorough investigation should issues be identified. The regulations before you have been developed on a long journey since 2008. Since then, two formal consultation exercises have taken place and many meetings have been held with interested parties such as the Ireland Road Transport Association and the Transport Committee of the Chamber of Commerce. The former had reservations about the regulations, whereas the latter have put increasing pressure on the Department to introduce regulations to aid their business operations in the United Kingdom and Europe. Since 2000, during the development of the regulations, as I've said, there's been a significant amount of engagement. And since 2008 and 2012, there has been a significant lightening of the regulations. Where now, as far as in particular, when we refer to on-island operations, it is a simple licensing system. The Road Transport Regulation 2018 are supported by the Road Transport Licensing Committee, which is responsible for the licensing or registration of operators.
Minister for the Department of Infrastructure Ray Harmer speaking in Tynwald in July this year. Those regulations were approved by the court and will begin to be phased in from January next year. So what implications will they have for HGV operators? RTLC Chair Brendan O'Friel again.
It's actually very important here that the HGV operators realise that this change is coming about, because unlike in 2002 when the taxi regulation was put under the RTLC, the heavy goods vehicle operators are now for the very first time going to come under a regulator, and quite a lot of them may not be fully aware of that and what that implies. So we're going to be putting material on our website to encourage people to look at it. We've started ourselves going around and talking to some of the operators, and we'll be looking at other ways of publicising the fact that this very big change is coming about. The reason we're having a change is, quite frankly, public safety. Elsewhere in, I think, Western Europe, certainly in the UK, HGVs have been regulated for quite some time. We were actually getting very concerned that the regulators in England would start taking a very firm line on our lorries coming into the UK if we didn't have regulation on the island to guarantee that standards were set at a reasonable standard. So the fact we're bringing in regulation is actually safeguarding our external trade from the island, our really important external connections, day-to-day trade that's coming to and from the UK, which, as we all know, fills the shops and helps industry and helps in all sorts of ways. So it's very important. Why did it come about? It came about because after the initial delays, there was that very serious accident some 10 years ago now when a young person was killed by a wheel coming off a lorry. And I think that has motivated the politicians to say we've really got to fall in line with what is required and to bring ourselves into really the 21st century in the way we regulate are heavy goods vehicles.
And it always seems surprising that vehicles of that nature up until January haven't been under stricter regulation at all.
It is extremely surprising. And I think what happened was that having got the Act through and having got PPVs regulated, I think the politicians in a sense almost took their eye off the ball, and there were considerable rows going on about all sorts of issues around taxis, and I think that tended to absorb people's energies. But it's great that the Department of Infrastructure, in particular the Minister, has pushed this through. Tynwald has agreed it and has supported it by an overwhelming majority, and what we'll do now is from the 1st of January, is to gradually bring this in. It might be helpful if I explained the sort of thing that we're talking about, because what in a sense does regulation mean? And there are really 4 elements to it that people need to know about. First of all, a HGV operator has got to have good repute, and I've talked a bit earlier on about the need for PPV operators to have good repute. So it's similar to that, and obviously that includes things like convictions, complaints, the way they run their business. There's then a requirement for professional competence, obviously a requirement of some sort of financial standing, and that operating centres, and this is perhaps even more important for HGVs, are suitable. So there is going to be tests brought in to make sure that the HGV trade operates in an effective way and a safe way on the island.
There were concerns beforehand that these checks that are going to have to be carried out on a daily basis, in some cases, could be quite onerous. I mean, what sort of changes does it mean for the people who are operating them? I mean, we know you'll be checking up on them, but how are you going to know that they're doing the checks they're meant to be doing? And what exactly are the checks? Are they onerous?
No, the checks are not onerous. The checks, I'm sure the general public would regard as being absolute common sense. They mirror to a degree what we've been asking of the PPV trade, in the sense that you start off with a daily walk-around check before you use the vehicle to make sure that lights are working, that it's safe to use. You have regular maintenance inspections to prevent things going wrong. You service the vehicle as the vehicle manufacturer decrees, and you keep a good record of what you've done so that it's possible to see how the vehicle has been maintained and that it has been checked every day that it's being used. And those records have got to be produced when the vehicle goes up to the test centre for its annual test. And of course, if we have concerns about a particular operator, or we've received complaints or whatever it may be, the RTLC will be wanting to inspect those maintenance records so that we're satisfied that maintenance is being carried out to a decent standard. Now, for most operators on the island, I'm sure, they're doing a reasonably good standard of maintenance, but there'll be some who are cutting corners, and as a result of cutting corners are keeping their costs down, and that's of course really anti-competitive, and it's certainly not in the public interest. We want to bring standards all up to a reasonable standard, and I'm sure that'll be achieved over the next few years.
And in the regulations there is reference to the parking of HGVs. That's not necessarily something you would think the RTLC would have anything to do with.
Well, the RTLC's interest in all this is really in the operating centre, where the vehicles are kept overnight. And I'm aware that there are some issues about this, and we're talking to planning about this so that we understand a bit more about how the whole thing operates. What we do know is that because this is a new venture, the regulation of HGVs, it's being brought in gradually, and for the centres, the operating centres, there will be a period of years before, if you like, the rules clamp down on them hard, to give people an opportunity to adjust. That's rather similar to the fact that the first year, that's 2019, all the on-island operators have got the opportunity to register free as long as the process is completed by the end of the year. So practical purposes, if they will register between January and October, they'll get free registration. If they fail to do that, they'll have to pay for registration, in the future. So there are some useful ways in which we've made the introduction of regulation slow and steady, but nonetheless quite purposeful in terms of driving up safety standards.
And are there more regulations you'd like to bring in? You've now got certain powers over taxis in terms of keeping them safe on the roads, and you've also, these HGV regulations are coming in. Are there other areas in the island that that you think the committee should be looking at and should have some regulatory powers over?
I think that we'll no doubt learn a great deal in the coming years about the HGV trade and whether the powers that are in the Act are adequate, whether they achieve the objective of driving up standards or not. And I'm sure we'll find things that could be done better. So I just keep a very open mind on that. Although the committee has got 3 members with very considerable experience of the trade, the HGV trade, we'll all be learning a great deal about how to regulate, what the issues are, and the trade similarly will be learning how to cope with being regulated. So it's a gradual process. It's one that will eventually see some very positive results, and I'm sure will gradually push up the standards of these vehicles.
Now, you touched on this earlier, but how much engagement does the RTLC have with the public?
Not as much as I would like, is the straight answer. I'm pleased to say that there's a big public consultation planned within weeks now about the future of the PPV trade and some of the changes we're thinking of bringing in. And I do hope that as many people who've used taxis and private hire vehicles recently will respond to that, because we really need a big cross-section of the public. It will also, for the first time, give us an idea of how satisfied or otherwise the public are with the trade, because there have been no surveys done that really give us that sort of information. So we've been rather working in the dark. And the danger with a regulator like the RTLC is that we see complaints, but on the whole we don't see much in the way of compliments, and I'd like to see more compliments coming in. Occasionally I hear of them from anecdotal sources, and it's really very encouraging when you hear, as I did only the other day, of a party coming into the island on the Lake Gatwick flight, pouring with rain at Ronald's Way, and the driver was described to me by the leader of the party as being really helpful, bringing the car up to the door so that they didn't get soaked, delivering them to their destination effectively, and charging what they thought was a very reasonable fee. So it's not all bad news. There's a lot of people out there doing a good job, and we need to hear about those as well as the ones who are causing difficulties.
Looking ahead, we've seen all sorts of new technology being pioneered in other places. What implications does that have for the Isle of Man should someone decide to bring it here?
Well, there are 2 areas really where new technology is coming in. One is in the booking of the vehicles and the sort of control over the vehicles, and the 3 bases in Douglas all are, I think, modernising their systems and trying to provide a better service to customers. Again, we'd be delighted to know if that is indeed what the public think. People are always concerned about, will Uber suddenly come in and what impact might that have? I think it's entirely possible that I think it's inevitable that sooner or later somebody's going to set up an application of the Uber type on the island in competition and provide that sort of a service, provided whoever it is or whatever organisation it is uses licensed vehicles, licensed drivers, and operates in a fair and competitive manner. I don't think we'll have too many difficulties with that, but we'll wait and see what develops there. So there's booking cabs. On the other front, there is of course a lot of interest in how a vehicle is going to change. Are we going to see electric taxis on the island? What can we do to reduce pollution? I mean, heaven knows, looking even further ahead, what about tests of driverless taxis? There are all sorts of fascinating things which demonstrate that the world is not going to stand still. It's why we as a regulator have to encourage the trade to keep moving forward, to keep developing, and at the end of the day, so that they provide a safe and affordable service to their passengers around the island.
So from your perspective, you'll be keeping a watchful eye on all of those developments?
We most certainly will, and I know that there are MHKs who are really interested in whether electric vehicles could be used to a greater extent in the PPV fleet. We've certainly got absolutely no objection to that. It's a sort of commercial matter, really, for the operators of PPVs to decide what is the most effective way of doing it. And of course, hybrid vehicles are becoming increasingly common as well.
Chair of the Road Transport Licensing Committee, Brendan O'Frill. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be back at the same time next week. But for now, have a very good afternoon.